much to the pleasure of Dimitrios, his last two ladies stayed in Boston. And I would like to give the floor to Lorelei Mucci, Associate Professor of Epidemiology and Head of the Cancer Epidemiology Tract at HSPH, who will present to us prostate cancer epidemiology through the lens of Dimitrios Trichopoulos.
Great. Thank you, Pogona, Antonia, Michelle. It's all really so wonderful to be with so many of his dear friends, his family, and his colleagues. And I'm delighted to be here on the stage with these wonderful individuals. I followed Hannah as Dimitrios' doctoral student, and Hannah found me out as it was described, and she had sort of pitched the idea that I should work with him. And then I remember an afternoon she came by, she said, okay, Lorelei, it's time for you to come meet Dimitrios, and you should come this afternoon. And I was really absolutely terrified. Why would this giant in the field of cancer epidemiology want to work with someone like me? And I think within probably the first 10 or 15 minutes already, you felt as if you were part of his family, because he was so welcoming and so kind and so warm. So we never worked on really prostate cancer together. It was an area that I became interested in much after I was his student. But the work that I do, I every day think about so many of the lessons that I learned from him. And so what I decided to do was just pick one story in prostate cancer that our group has been involved in this year, because I think it exemplifies many of the important principles of research that Dimitrios taught me and taught all of us. So this was a study that was published earlier this year to look at the association between vasectomy and the risk of prostate cancer among men in the health professionals follow-up study. And the two researchers who led this study were Minaj Siddiqui, who was an MPH student at the time and is now a urologist at the University of Maryland, and Kathy Wilson, who at the time was a postdoc, but now has quickly risen to the ranks of research scientists at the School of Public Health. And so we worked on this collaboratively to follow up on a study that Ed Giovannucci had published in this area, looking at early data in the health professionals and showing an increased risk of prostate cancer associated with the men who had had vasectomy. So what this, as you can imagine, a study like this generated, back in the 1990s, generated a huge debate and questions about the validity of the findings. There had been a few, but not many follow-up studies, but we felt this was, given the high prevalence of vasectomy, particularly among men in the US as well as other countries, this was really an important public health question that we should get to the bottom of. This particular paper was selected among the best. It was published in the Journal of Oncology. It was among the top 10 in Journal of Oncology for 2015. It was the only epidemiology study. So I think Dimitrios would be proud that we were the only epidemiology study there. So why did we study this? Well, vasectomy is quite common in the US. There's 500,000 men will undergo vasectomy each year in the United States. In overall, about 15% of adult men will undergo vasectomy. There had been conflicting evidence, as I had mentioned, but a pooled study had looked at all prospective cohort data and suggested that men who had had a vasectomy had about a 37% increased risk of prostate cancer compared to men who had not. One of the big concerns, however, was that men who undergo vasectomy, those vasectomies are performed by urologists, and perhaps the reason for this increased association that was observed is really due to diagnostic intensity that the men were undergoing. So really it was a bias and not a true association. So we we sort of went into this study thinking, I think our hypothesis was that this association was causal, but we took the approach that Dimitrios would have wanted us to do, which was to question even ourselves and test this hypothesis in every direction and try to rule out every potential bias and confounding factor. And so we undertook this study with the idea to deeply investigate the association of vasectomy of prostate cancer, with really being able to finally control for diagnostic intensity and screening, and then also studying the risk of aggressive cancer. So we undertook it within the health professionals among 49,000 men who were ages 40 to 75 at baseline. And the question on vasectomy was asked frequently. At baseline in 1986, 22% of the men had undergone vasectomy, and then through 1998, 25% of the men had undergone vasectomy. And so in this cohort of 49,000 men, 6,000 have been diagnosed with prostate cancer through 2010, of which 811 of them had advanced or lethal disease. And so these are the estimates of excess risk of prostate cancer associated with vasectomy. And so this is for prostate cancer overall. This is for risk of prostate cancer in men whose cancer went on to develop metastasis, or for men who died of their cancer. And advanced cancers were men with an advanced stage disease. And then Gleason grade is the grading system used in prostate cancer, and Gleason 8 to 10 are men who have the highest grade prostate cancer. And when we accounted for many of the HPFS is rich in potential confounding data, and when we controlled for these in the analyses, we found that there was a small but significant increased risk of prostate cancer overall, about a 10% increased risk, and an even stronger risk for advanced or lethal form of the disease, so about a 20 to 30% increased risk for more advanced cancer. But we still wondered whether this association could be attributed to bias. We controlled for PSA screening, yes or no, in this analysis, but I believe it was either Kathy and or Ed who said, let's look more finely within a highly screened population of men in HPFS, men who get regular PSA screening, and let's see if we still see the association there. And so PSA testing was first asked in 1992, and so what we did was to look at men who had received a PSA screening in 1994 and 1996, and then looked at the association in that subcohort. And what was really interesting to see was the following, is when we looked at the association with total prostate cancer risk, essentially that small but significant association is attenuated, and essentially no association between vasectomy and risk of prostate cancer overall, suggesting some of that positive association, or most of it, could be attributed to intensity of PSA screening. However, after accounting for screening patterns, if anything, the hazard ratios were stronger, and so that men who had had a vasectomy had about a 40 to 50% increased risk of an advanced or lethal prostate cancer compared to men who had not had vasectomy. So we felt, if anything, men who are going to be screened are actually, you're going to identify those cases earlier, so less likely to be advanced cancer. So if there was any residual diagnostic bias, if anything, if you could account for that, if anything, we thought maybe the findings would get stronger. So we felt that screening could not account for these positive findings. So next, we wanted to look more deeply. Well, is there some residual confounding that we haven't considered? And so we looked, we had some blood biomarker data on a number of sexually transmitted infections with the idea that men who have vasectomies may be more likely to engage in risky sexual behaviors. And indeed, actually, men who had had a vasectomy did have a higher prevalence of prior chlamydia infection and HPV infection. Interestingly, there was no difference in the prevalence of some of these other infections. But what was interesting was that when we adjusted for these factors in the analysis, there was no difference in the association between vasectomy and advanced prostate cancer. Another hypothesis was there, and this is more looking at potential biologic mediators of the association. There was a hypothesis that men who had had vasectomies, that may alter their levels of different sex steroid hormones. And so within our data, we were able to look at plasma levels of a number of sex hormones in this cohort. And what was interesting to see, actually, was there was no difference in plasma levels of these sex hormones. So sex hormones could not be explaining this observed association. And then finally, given that the findings specifically seemed for advanced or lethal prostate cancer, perhaps men who are undergoing vasectomy are getting different types of treatments for their cancer, and those treatments are the reason that you're seeing an increased risk of lethal disease. But in fact, actually, there was no difference in the types of treatments that men with and without vasectomy were electing, so that couldn't account for our findings. So we felt, in summary, we felt, well, this is really interesting, and we really did try our best to explain away these findings. And I think that was something that Dimitrios always instilled in all of us, that you actually should be probably the biggest doubter of your own hypotheses, that you should always challenge yourself to seek the truth. And so we felt like we've done the most rigorous possible analysis within this data. Although interesting, I was at a meeting and someone said, well, do you think this is causal? And I gave probably the most Dimitrios appropriate message, which is, well, I think further study, this is really interesting. We've accounted for every potential bias, but we really need to do additional studies to examine it. So Kathy Wilson was really keen to continue on this line of evidence and look within a tissue biobank that we've developed within the health professionals follow-up study. And we have on a subset of the men in the cohort done whole genome gene expression profiling. And so the question was, and there had been some interesting studies in rats suggesting that there were immediate and then even longer-term permanent effects in the tissue biology associated with rats undergoing vasectomy. And so she wanted to ask the question, if we look in the tumor tissue or adjacent normal tissue of these men who've undergone vasectomy, and we compare the gene expression profiles of those men to the men who have not had vasectomy, do we see any significant differences in the tissue biology? And could this give us some hints about biology and whether this really could be a causal association? And what was really interesting to see was when you looked in the gene expression profiles and you looked at pathways of genes, there was essentially no difference in the tumor tissue. However, when you looked in the adjacent normal tissue for these same men, all of whom had prostate cancer, this is where some really interesting differences appeared. And all of these particular pathways were more highly expressed in the men who had undergone vasectomy. And what was interesting to see was a number of pathways related to inflammation and autoimmune response. And this was definitely in line with what some of the results from the experiments in animal models had shown. And then when you looked at what pathways that were downregulated in the men who had had a vasectomy, these were all pathways, or many of which were pathways related to DNA repair pathways. So these pathways were lower in the men who had undergone vasectomy. And then there were also a couple of interesting metabolic pathways. And Kathy's going to be following this up with some additional work. So I feel this has been a really exciting study to be in, and I hope that Dimitrios would have been happy with the approach that we took, and I think he would have. So just to kind of summarize what we think, it seems like there's a small but significant increased risk of advanced and lethal prostate cancer. However, when we came out with this paper, we wanted to emphasize that with this absolute increase in risk was very small. It was statistically significant, but a very small increased risk. And so we were very cautious in saying that men really need to think more broadly about their own health care and contraceptive choices in interpreting these results. Also, we felt like we've ruled out potential bias confounding from sexually transmitted infections, hormone screening, and cancer treatments. And the gene expression data are really interesting and may suggest there's lasting effects of vasectomy on the normal prostate microenvironment. So I think thinking through this, I feel like Dimitrios always encouraged us to be bold in our hypothesis and definitely not to be afraid to be wrong. A really amazing memory that I have of our time together was with Rula and Hannah and Pagona, and this was actually before Lauren, we were after Lauren and Lisa had left, and I remember not only wanting to live up to the high standards that Dimitrios had, but also the amazing standards that the two of them had set for being these amazing doctoral students. But we would sit together in a room, and it was overheated in Dimitrios' office with Pagona, and Hans Olaf was there, and Anders Ekbom, and Rula, and these crazy ideas it seemed like they were crazy, coming out of nowhere, just coming out of people's mouths, and we would sort of, what data do we have? How can we do it? And it was such a wonderful team environment. And by the end of a week's visit, we would have generated a couple of really cool papers and new scientific hypotheses. And Dimitrios always said, be ready for success, but be more so ready for failures. And I think one of my first thesis papers, when it got rejected from a journal, I was feeling pretty dejected myself. And he said, I have so many more rejections than you'll ever have in your life. And I think that really helped me. And I hope I've tried to pass that on to people I work with too. And I think that has been really important. One of the most amazing things was Dimitrios would talk about Chung She, and he would say he's such a humble and generous and kind man. He would talk about Chung that way. And for Dimitrios, those qualities were more important than intellect or productivity. Being kind and being generous and being humble were so key qualities to have in science. And then, of course, the importance of mentoring. This is a silly figure that I put together. Just, I wanted to show, this is sort of our Boston family tree, that I think the effect that Dimitrios has can be shown by now. I'm passing on to my people, and then those people are now themselves mentors to many other people around the world. And so just this few people that he's mentored here have led to this exponential growth of mentorship around the world. And I was so glad that Murray read the really wonderful letter from Hans Olaf, and I know that he really would have wanted to be here today, but for me, their friendship together and the two smiles on their face really reflect the time that I had with them, and I learned so much from both of them. And then finally, we all picked these pictures of our families without knowing that we were doing this, but I think this really goes to show how much Dimitrios really loved these children. He had his own relationships. And it's also interesting, I noticed that many of the pictures are from Legal Seafoods, which was the restaurant that he loved to take us to as the only place. I only went to 2 other places with him in all the time I've known him, but he and Pagona actually were the first people to meet my son Ethan when he was born. They showed up in the hospital just a few hours after he was born, and already then Dimitrios had this special relationship with Ethan, and it's something that Ethan really has cherished. So I'm so grateful for the impact that Dimitrios has had on my professional life and my personal life and my family life. And I really do miss him a lot. And I'm so glad to be here with all of you today. Thank you.